The following is a conversation I had together with Zevi Slavin. I originally met Zevi several years ago when a mutual friend of ours, shout out to Sarah, recommended that he come spend the Shabbat by me out on the hilltop. Sadly, I don't get to see Zevi very often, and I certainly don't have enough discussions with him. But when we do meet up, our talks are always incredibly deep and insightful. Zevi is a true philosopher chassid who also has his own YouTube channel called Seekers of Unity, which you should totally check out, and I'm super thankful that he was able to set aside time to talk with me. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Zevi.
Let's take it away. So you want to discuss philosophy mainly? Was that the?
I don't know. You're the host. You get to choose what we discuss.
I think so. I love it because I have this like theoretical conspiracy theory, which for me it doesn't even matter if it's true or not. It's just a cute way of looking at things. That the Rambam couldn't really care less for the philosophy of his day, but he understood that we need an intellectual version of Judaism for people who are, philosophical.
I like that right off the bat in the first 10 seconds we have a conspiracy theory launched into the into the metaverse here. I don't think so, simply because if you look at the Rambam's engagement with Aristotelianism, which is his primary tradition, Andalusian peripatetic Aristotelianism, he's like very deeply committed to it from a very early age. His first work of philosophy, which is a work on logic, is a work of Aristotelian logic through the lens of Al-Farabi, and I think he writes that like it's in his like early 20s or late teens that he writes that already. So from a very young age, he's committed to Aristotle, both in his logic, both in his cosmology, his metaphysics, his epistemology, and he really speaks of him in the highest glowing terms possible. He says that Aristotle reaches the highest possible levels of human wisdom without prophecy, and there has to be a lot of in like facetiousness that we're assuming on his behalf, or a lot of like a disingenuousness that we're assuming to take such a conspiracy seriously. So I would have to say no.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true. In other words, because if you look at Torah in the sense of every generation understands it with their means of mode of understanding within their logical framework or whatever, then in other words, each person in their day is reaching their highest level. But that doesn't mean that that's the ultimate truth. In other words, we keep advancing and we keep changing, and as we change, maybe our understanding is supposed to change too. But the best current understanding, that's your current highest level. Does that
Yeah,
make
so there's a
sense?
notion in Christian theology called progressive revelation, which is that the God's truth is revealed slowly over the generations, and that's why there are truths that we can have later that we don't have earlier. And it's a very useful apologetic tool used predominantly in Catholicism. Um, and no, I don't. I'm not saying this to make fun of it.
I
And
know, I know.
there definitely is similar application of these ideas when it comes to Rambam, when it comes to Maimonides, or when it comes to the positions taken by Chazal, the early rabbinic figures, because it seems to be that there's both a progression, a development in their theology, and that their theology is in accordance with the science of its day, or the philosophy of its day, which is not the philosophy of our day. So when we have rabbinic passages in the Talmud speaking about a Ptolemaic cosmology, or the worldview that we no longer hold by. So there's different ways of dealing with that from an Orthodox perspective, and one is to say that there's sort of a progressive revelation; things become revealed to us on and on as we go. But it does seem from Maimonides himself that he does believe that Aristotelianism really is the highest level of human expression of human wisdom, and to the point, as we would say in Yeshivish, ad kdei kach, that in his Guide to the Reflex, in his Moreh Nevuchim, he writes that the only reason why I, Maimonides, am not giving you a reading of Genesis that presents a theory which is a creation non ex nihilo, which is in Latin creation ex aliquo, creation out of something, that there's a primordial eternal matter. The reason why I'm not doing that, which seems to be Aristotle's position, the reason I'm not reading Genesis that way is because Aristotle seems to be a bit inconclusive. We can read Aristotle differently. But if Aristotle would have to be read as against creation ex nihilo, I, right Maimonides, would read Genesis that way as well. So it seems that which is a point which upset a lot of people. But it seems that there's this very, very strong
But
reverend.
in my conspiracy theory, that works really, really well.
Yeah, well, how?
Just throwing that out there.
No,
Because he's just trying to fit it. You know what I mean?
what I'm saying is that it seems to be that there's a certain priority that he's giving to logic and to rationality and to demonstrability and to that which can be figured out with the human intellect, which he believes is God given, which he believes is actually the link that connects us to God. It's the image. It's the image of God in mankind, is the intellect, writes Maimonides, and he sees that intellect most finely expressed in the Muslim Aristotelian tradition, until the point where when he's willing to reread Genesis, the same way that he rereads the anthropomorphism, the way that the Bible describes God having bodily proportions, based on his logical reasoning why that cannot be the case. He reads it against the Bible. He says that God doesn't literally have a body, God doesn't literally descend on Sinai, etc., etc. He said he'd be willing to do the same with creation ex nihilo, with the question of whether there was primordial matter or not, if Aristotle was only more conclusive on the matter. So so it seems that he's quite committed to an Aristotelian position, at least in the earlier parts of the guide.
It's funny you should when you mention that part about like the intellect. So there's this really enigmatic. I mean, the whole sefer is enigmatic, but I started relearning the Bahir now with the Chavrus of mine from America, Shimon Goldberg. Shout out to Shimon. And there's this little mashal that the Bahir brings, and it's unclear exactly what he's bringing the mashal for, but he says it's like God who is like a king who marries off his son and his daughter to each other, and he gives the daughter to his son, and he says, "Do with her as you please." And this whole piece is super enigmatic, but I think what he's saying is that Torah is like a daughter, and our intellect is the son. And God is giving the Torah to our intellect and saying, interpret it.
Yeah, it's often a metaphor used. You see a similar metaphor in the Zohar, where the Torah is the bride, and Chachma is often seen as the masculine, as opposed to Bina, which is seen as feminine. So the intellect as masculine versus understanding as feminine, and it's Chachma, it's the human wisdom which unites with Torah, which is the wisdom of God, and there's the union of the masculine and feminine. Yeah, so it's certainly a very rich, often erotic and evocative theme that's used throughout the Kabbalists.
Right. I think this concept, I coined the term like last year. I'm like, books don't read themselves, you know? And people get very bent out of shape. But when someone says, the Torah says X, Y, and Z, what they're really saying is, I am saying that, and I'm either reading it into or extracting it out of
Right.
the Torah,
Yeah.
or both, really.
Yeah, I mean, in contemporary philosophy, there's an old idea which is known as the death of the author, that there really is no access to any original intention. Yeah, this is a very popular idea in modern, and then more so in postmodern
I love
philosophy,
that.
where there just is no access to what we cannot get into the mind of the author. We cannot say this is what the text meant. We can only say this is how the text has been read, or this is how we are reading it. And it's definitely the case when it comes to Torah. That Torah, the Gemara says that kipati tzela, that like a hammer strikes a rock and it shoots off sparks in 70 directions, so to the Torah is open to 70 facets, 70 faces, like the faces of a diamond, of multiple interpretations, which is not, it's a deconstruction, which isn't an annihilation or a destruction of the Torah. It's one which opens it up to perpetual interpretation, perpetual reinterpretations and reapplications for every day of our lives.
Yeah. I definitely relate to that. Sometimes I'll be talking to people, though, and I'll tell them, listen, there are 70 interpretations, but what you're saying is the 71st, and it's just wrong.
There is an idea of this, what's known as Shivim Panim Latera and Shivim Acharayim Latera, there is, which we don't need to translate necessarily.
Yeah, I think that concept is often like heavily abused, to just read in whatever you want and be like, oh yeah.
Yeah, I think the question is, what is guiding our readings? What ethos are we bringing to our readings? Are we trying to read the text in a way that's going to challenge us to be kinder and more thoughtful and more accepting and more compassionate and more understanding and more dedicated and devoted? Then those are good readings as far as I'm concerned. And it doesn't seem like there's much more of a stronger metric. I mean, if you look at the way that the Hasidic masters read the text, the more wild the reading, the more enjoyable it seems to be for them, but readings that lead us to egotism and to hatred and to self-centrism and these seem to be bad readings. It seems that there's more of a hermeneutical ethic than an exegetical ethic, if that makes sense.
Can you explain those terms for
Yeah.
laymen like myself?
So there is a history in Judaism of trying to define rules of interpretation, right? So we have the most famous, which practicing Jews say every single day in their Shacharit prayers, is the 13 principles of interpretation from Rabbi Shmuel, from the Talmudic period, and there are others given. There's the principles of Rabbi Gamliel, which are not as popular, and Akiva has his own principles, which Yishmael develops them from. But he gives 13, but they're really like 13,000. The same way that there are 613 commandments, but they're really 613,000, right? Because each one becomes its own universe in and of itself, and each one is like embedded and encoded and interacting with one another. So ultimately, I think what guides the hermeneutic, what guides the reading. Hermeneutic is just a fancy term for the way you read a text, which comes from the Greek god Hermes, who's the messenger god. What messages do we take from a text? The same word that gets picked up by Hermeticism, because they have a part of their pantheon is Hermes Trismegistus. But what guides our readings is not necessarily any sort of strict linguistic rules of we don't read like a prat and a klal and a prat and a klal and a prat, whatever the rules are for Rabbi Shmuel, but rather it seems that practically what guides the readings are what ethos, what ethic are we trying to bring out of the text. So for the Hasidic readers, their guiding ethos, let's say, is that God is the only thing that exists, ein od milvado. So any biblical reading which is going to support that, even in very, very bizarre and counterintuitive ways, will be an acceptable reading. And that's part of the beauty. I think something which isn't quite yet understood by the broader public, and both the general public and academia, is the fun that Judaism has historically with reading its own texts, and how important that activity is, and how important the funness of it. Like when we speak about Yagdil Torah v'Yader, there's this necessity to expand upon Torah and to beautify it. The way that it's beautified is by us playfully engaging with it. And there is something, to go back to the metaphor we used earlier, there's something erotic here and playful, where we tease the text and we ask it to come out, and we play with it, and it tempts us and we tempt it, and there's this kind of this erotic play within the text itself, which is for anyone that spent time doing that, they know it's a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I think I was talking to a friend of mine, Bernie. I actually had him on the first podcast, and he mentioned this midrash, this story from the rabbis about God asking all these different, concepts about whether or not he should give the Torah, create man, or give the Torah. I think create man, or give the Torah to man, and he asked truth, and truth said, "Don't do it. Men is dishonest." And it said God ended up casting truth out of heaven, and that's what the verse says, emes me'eretz titzmach, that truth sprouts forth from the ground.
Yeah,
right?
A very beautiful medrash.
And I was thinking about it recently. It was was it about creation? Do you know that medrash?
It's about whether humanity should be created. Yeah,
created. I was thinking about it recently. I think what that concept is saying, emes me'eretz titzmach, is that you see if something is true based on whether or not it grows. What they mean by that is, how do you know if your car works if it gets you to your destination?
Right. Yeah. So what's beautiful here is that we're now like performing or demonstrating what we just spoke about. This way of taking a text, we're taking a midrashic text, and which itself is reading an early biblical text, and we're going to play with it a little here. We're going to see like what readings can we tease out of it. How can we reread this? And that notion, I think is a beautiful notion, which later gets put into the canon of Western philosophy through the lenses of people like Peirce and James and pragmatism, where ideas are true if they have cash value, if they can do something good in our practical lives. Otherwise, an abstract truth that happens to be true is a meaningless truth. So if it grows, James often speaks about. I actually have James's book here, the varieties. James speaks about what are the fruits of a proposition, and that's the idea of by the fruits thou shalt know them, right? So does it grow fruit? Does it blossom into something beautiful? Otherwise, it's not really worth engaging in. I think there's also another, just to continue playing with this text here of truth sprouting from the ground. MS me'aretz titzmach, is there's a really beautiful notion of prophecy ending, which is another crazy Talmudic passage about the end of prophecy, and which is a very contentious one because it seems that throughout the literature of Jewish history, there's prophecy which continues again and again and again after that.
I was gonna say it's my next conspiracy theory. Rabbi Kaplan doesn't think it ended; he thinks it went underground.
Oh, so
It became a hidden tradition.
I don't know if you use that word intentionally there, but you just said underground, and I specifically want to point to that point there because there is a Hasidic reading which says that truth never ended. Truth just went into the ground because the truth is in the ground, and
I didn't even think about that.
And because we all walk so high on our tippy toes with our noses in the air, none of us hear the voice of God anymore. None of us hear the kol dmama daka, the silent voice of God. But if we can get low enough, if we can put our ear to the earth, if we can get humble, and if we can make ourselves small, then we'll hear the truth sprouting from the ground itself, bubbling up from underground. So
Wow.
I like that you said it. I don't know if you said that intentionally.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And
I did not.
just this is just a demonstration of what it is to take a text and play with it, and really, and I think what's coming out of this demonstration is as well, what's guiding our interpretations is our ethic, right? So the point that you wanted to bring out was a point of fruitfulness and whether something has what are the actual benefits of something, and how do we see what the benefits is, and I'm bringing out a point of humility, like different values that we hold valuable to us, and that's what's guiding our creative and playful, maybe even erotic rereadings.
Wow, that's beautiful.
I hope this doesn't get demonetized.
Listen, if it does, it does. It's
Yeah.
really not about that. It's really about people hearing this, connecting to it, hearing what you have to say. I feel like there's a certain aspect of, listen, my conspiracy theory in the beginning, like maybe I was completely wrong with Maimonides. I could be totally wrong, but I think in general, I would love it if Torah and the Jewish tradition had more intellectual interpretations and readings, and also more mystical interpretations and readings. Just more avenues for people to connect where they feel like they would connect. In general, I feel like it exists on every dimension. It fractalizes and stuff like that. And very often we portray a very small aspect of it, and we're like, this is the entire picture, and like that's it. And I wish like when I was in high school, people had been like, listen, if you connect more to Chassidus, study Chassidus. You connect more to Kabbalah, study Kabbalah. You connect more to Breslev, become Breslev. Like, I don't think it has to be like, I think for me that's the 12 tribes in Israel, the 12 Shvatim, is that everyone has their way to connect, and that's beautiful. Like, use your way, but we somehow box it in and we think like, my way is the way, and you have to connect the way I connect. That's what we tell our children, and that's a cancer.
Yeah. I think this is, to hop on, I don't think this is a fault of the history of Jewish thought and Jewish literature, because there sure is plenty of it, and it's beautifully diverse and rich and fecund. But I think to beat a dead horse already, I think this is definitely the fault of contemporary Jewish education, and there are great Jewish educational institutes and educators who are trying to combat this actively, and I salute their efforts because it is not easy. And I've been an educator. I still consider myself one, and so. But I think that there's a certain reactionary fear, which is a response both to modernity and then heightened by the Holocaust, where Judaism feels like it needs to protect itself. And the way that it protects itself is reactionary. So Judaism sees movements coming out like the Enlightenment, and they see Jews that move off into Haskalah, into the Jewish Enlightenment, which branch off into Reform Judaism, which what we know today as Orthodoxy feels is no longer Jewish. And what they do is they create this reactionary category called Orthodoxy, which literally just means correct belief, orthodoxia, and which is a very strange concept in Jewish history. We don't have orthodoxy in Jewish history. We have orthopraxy. We have halacha, defining how a Jew practices. But to define how a Jew believes is really just not a very Jewish idea at all. One of my favorite ironies of the history of Jewish theology
that kind of what
Maimonides. Oh, so that's what I'm about to say. One of my favorite ironies of the history of Jewish theology is that Maimonides gets called a heretic for many reasons, and his books are burnt for a long time until they're accepted. One of the reasons why he gets called a heretic is for attempting to define the principles of belief by which one can be called a heretic. That very act is seen by the Abarbanel and by others as heretical, Chasdei Kreskas and others. And so they're very active trying to create labels of who is a heretic, which Maimonides puts forth in his 13 Principles of Faith, is seen as a heretical act, which is one of my favorite ironies of Jewish history, which points us to the idea that there really is not an orthodoxy. There's orthopraxy, and that's very important. And I think it's much richer and more beautiful than an orthodoxy. But there really is no orthodoxy in Jewish history as we know it today. And it really is a reaction to what is perceived as a threat from the outside, from modernity, from what at the time was European Enlightenment and later was an existential threat of the Holocaust. We need to hold on to our true belief. And I think that sometimes when we hold on to something so tight, we end up strangling it and we end up choking it to death. And I think what we're seeing today is a new generation which is so deeply comfortable in their Judaism. You grew up in a deeply, deeply Jewish home, and to you being Jewish is second nature. It's not something which is foreign to you. It's not something which you feel threatened by your, American identity or your shared identities. Like, it's so deeply, richly part of your DNA. And the same for me. And we therefore have this new freedom to be free to go back into our own history and be like, no, we can pull out a Chasdei Kreskas, we can pull out an Abarbanel, we can pull out a Rambam, we can pull out a Ibn Shaprut, we can pull out a Kabbalah, Musar, Chakira, Medrash, Chazal, and we can feel comfortable in the expansive home that is Judaism. There's the term of Tamaras's book, expanding the palaces of Torah. Like, Yagdil Torah V'Yadar means to expand Torah itself, to go back and to see that there's more than just, the cookie cutter version of orthodoxy, this very bizarre modern term. And I think that Judaism will be much more enriched.
Do you break down those terms, by the way?
Yeah. So doxia is like doxology is something that you affirm your belief in. If you like pledge allegiance to something, you're affirming a doxology, and ortho just means correct or straight. Like, you go to a orthodontist or orthopedist to get your feet straight and correct, and then orthopraxy, practice, is correct or straight practice, the practice in the right path, which is halacha, is that path, the right path to walk. So this notion of like orthodoxy, or this correct belief, is an idea which is very important for Christianity. Christianity has, in the first few centuries, the Council of Nicaea, and then many councils following that, trying to establish what must a Christian believe to be in right reconciliation with God, to merit eternal salvation. And that's just not the Jewish path. I have no problem with Christians having a doxology, and everyone's entitled to do religion as they please. But in Judaism, we don't do that. We have orthopraxy, and ultimately it's our actions which speak what's in our minds.
I think there's some truth to both of those. I'll get back to that in a second. What you reminded me of when you were talking, though, is I came up with this parable, with this mashal, like a while back, that there are these people who are like, the defenders of the Torah, and it's like they're standing watch over the king's palace, and maybe the king appointed them to stand watch over their palace, but at one point they maybe dozed off, and a couple people snuck in. And they're wreaking havoc right now in the palace. But these people are so concerned on not letting anyone else in that they won't even turn around and realize that there are some people in there that don't belong. And people come to the watchers, and they're like, "Yo, there's like someone's wreaking havoc in the palace. Like, we gotta figure this out. We gotta kick them out. We gotta work on this." And they're like, "I'm not turning around. I'm not falling for that." And they're like, "Don't you hear the noise?" And they're like, I'm watching. I'm making sure nobody gets into this palace. That's my job. No one's getting in." And meanwhile, the whole palace is getting torn to shreds from the inside out.
There definitely are some, I would say, some hate preachers who are making a mess inside. And I think the truth is, I think that there's one way of going about this, which is to try and be on the guard, to try and combat, what is counterfeit and what is fake, and what is derivative and what is. But I think I actually don't think that's the real way to do it. In Judaism we talk about two paths. There's Somei Ra, there's turning away from evil, and there's Asei Tov, there's doing good. And I think we can spend our lives in the work of combating darkness, in the Somei Ra, in fighting off evil. Or we can simply be in the work of Asei Tov, of doing good. And I think the more good we do, bad itself automatically dissipates and falls away. You don't actually have to combat it actively. You can Surmeira, read the Chassidic readers. Again, a creative reading is just ignore Surmeira, just leave the bad, Aseitav, and focus on doing good. And I think that if there's enough true currency in circulation, the counterfeit currency will fall out of place on its own, instead of trying to track it down and creating any sort of witch hunts. I think there's too much energy given to the temple wreckers.
That's beautiful.
If we spend our time trying to call them out, hamisnavel and menovel misnavel gamkein, someone that fights with someone who's dirties themselves in the process. And it's better, I think, just to remember what are our ideals, what are our practices, what are our values, and to be committed to those, and in the process, whatever needs to happen will happen.
Amen. Going back to the practice versus belief, though, I think that a lot of the Jewish practice, again, is meant to help direct our consciousness as well to understanding ideas and beliefs. In other words, we're not saying Shema because God needs a lip service. We're saying Shema because we're supposed to think about it and try to understand, there's this unity in the world, right?
So let's make a distinction here between belief and consciousness. Belief means that I assent to certain propositions, that there's a certain faith in certain values or propositions that I come to, and that's a belief, and that's a correct belief. In episteme, let's say in Greek, versus what we might call a pistis, which is that there's a certain state of mind, a state of consciousness, which I would like to be in. That state of consciousness is one which understands that there is nothing but God, and in that space of mind, I can be fulfilling the practice of Shiviti Hashem L'negdi Tamid, that I can see God in front of me at all times in all things. I don't think that that's a belief. I think that's a state of consciousness, and it's a state of mind which is itself is an act, and one which gets expressed naturally in our acts. I can believe as a theory that that God is one, and then I can go and I can spend half my day trying to rip off elderly people out of their life savings. That's a belief which is not a state of consciousness. It's not a state of mind. It's a theoretical abstract belief.
So I would probably say with like Jordan Peterson that you don't really believe it.
Yeah, I mean, depending on.
I don't believe people believe what they say they believe.
Okay. I'll have to believe you then. But I think that's different. So
these words are.
I think you're right in what you're saying, that it's not about procuring. It's about procuring a state of mind, a state of consciousness.
Yeah, agreed.
A state of being.
So I think if you read through the New Testament, I think that was Jesus's trip. I think that ancient Christianity, which was really it was really, I think, ancient Judaism, was more of a Gnostic religion on a certain level. That I think Jesus wanted everyone to experience this idea of God, and somewhere along the line it got hijacked. I mean, Alan Watts goes into the actual words that were used. Apparently, when Jesus said, according to Alan Watts again, when Jesus said, "I am the Son of God," in ancient Latin, he didn't say "the." It was the indefinite article. The lack of a definite article in ancient Latin or whatever implies the indefinite article. So what he actually said was, "I am a son of God."
Right.
And then he says, "Greater works than I have done shall you do."
Right. Yeah.
He's trying to get everyone to have that God experience, to just, what did you call it before? That, not the belief, but the
state of mind, consciousness.
That like state of consciousness. Yeah, he's trying to lift everyone's state of consciousness, and then obviously the church had to come and hijack the entire thing and be like, no, like pedestalize Jesus, like he reached a higher state of consciousness, but you guys never will, so you have to listen to us.
Right. Yitzy, you're really trying to get us canceled here. Yeah. Well, just to flesh that point out a little, just on a technicality, Jesus, Latin wouldn't be the language that Jesus was speaking. Jesus was most likely speaking a mix of Aramaic and Hebrew, and which was first put into Greek in the Synoptic Gospels. There is definitely this, what you're referring to as a Gnostic Jesus, this Jesus who's committed to some sort of state of mind that we reach a God consciousness, let's say, and we actually do have a text from the Nag Hammadi library, which was discovered in the past, not too long ago, where there's a fifth gospel there known as the Gospel of Thomas, which is very popular right now, and Ellen Pagels has done a lot of really good scholarly work on it. And in that gospel, you see a very, dare I say, a very Hasidic Jesus, and really harping on this notion of the omnipresence of God in a very mystical sense. He says, split the stone, I am there; split the rock, I am there. There's even a very beautiful scene where just after the final supper, which according to most chronologies is a Pesach Seder, on the way to the crucifixion, Jesus, you don't have this in the Gospels, but in the Gnostic Gospel, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus stops and sings and dances with his Talmidim, with his students, almost like this vision of like a Chassidische Verbringen on the way to the crucifixion, on the way to this Mesiras Nefesh. It's a very, very, very interesting Jesus that we find there. And I'm definitely very sympathetic to that reading of the New Testament, and both the Gnostic and the standard New Testament. I don't feel like it's my role so much to tell Christians how they should believe, because it's not my religion after all. And although Jesus was Jewish and his first few followers were Jewish, and the movement was a early Jewish movement, as all the scholarship knows, it certainly left Judaism and was adapted by a new tradition. So it's not really my place to tell Christians how or what to believe. But certainly there are many Christians and many Christian scholars and many Christian leaders who are advocating and have advocated for the past 2 decades or so for this reading of Jesus, where he says, "Banim atem Lashem nekechem," that you are the children of God, the kingdom of heaven is within each of us. So this very radical move from this seeing one state as being oppressed under Roman occupation, which they were another time, to saying that no, like your liberation lies within your own hands, and through our own voluntary poverty and humility and kindness, we can liberate ourselves in the here and now, because we are the children of God, the image of God. I've done a bit of work on the channel in this regard. I made a video called "The Parable of the Sacred Tomato," where I used a metaphor of a bunch of vegetables in a garden patch, and how each one of them is really just like the embodiment of the entire cosmos in it, and then one of the vegetables gets elevated above the rest of them, and it's a pretty transparent metaphor for I think what goes on in early Christianity, along the lines of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so also.
You enjoy that video.
Obviously, it sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to find it, and maybe I'll post a card, at this point of the podcast. The elevated, it sounds great. To me, that's like, I've read the New Testament a couple times, and to me, like, once Alan Watts discusses this, really, he has a couple lectures on who really was Jesus Christ, and he says for anyone who's had any sort of mystical experience, it's to them it's like clear as day that this is what was going on.
Yeah, and it's certainly the reading. It's certainly also the reading of many Christian mystics throughout history, whether that's Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or Meister Eckhart or Magdalene Magdeburg. It's a very common reading amongst the Christian mystics. I'll tell you. I think I actually used this quote in the video. William Blake, an incredible poet and visionary and author and prophet. A Protestant mystic said, "Jesus is God, and so am I, and so are you." That's something. Maybe that's not the exact quotation, but something along those lines. So this is definitely a point which is not Alan Watts is only continuing to perpetuate an idea which has been said for hundreds of years, if not more, by Christian mystics.
Yeah, he goes through a list of all the mystics that were killed for saying this, and he's like, even if the Jews killed Jesus, like, no need to be upset at them. The Christians have been killing these people also for thousands of years.
I agree. That's
yeah.
Who's
and on a certain level, Rabbi Kaplan really discusses this. Yeah, what?
Whose line is it? There's someone I have to remember whose line this is. He says, "There was only one true Christian, and he died on the cross." Whose line is that? I have to remember.
It sounds very familiar, but I'm not sure. But it does sound very familiar. Yeah, Rabbi Kaplan a little bit discusses this when he talks about a conversation with God in Jewish meditation. He says you're really like digging deep down into the self, until you kind of realize there is no self. It's like you go through like nothingness, and then through that nothingness you find that like called the mamadaka, like that voice, that nothingness kind of ends up talking to you in this odd mystical way, and that's like a conversation with God.
Yes, you just laid out the entire mystical journey there from beginning to end very beautifully. That's you've said it all just there.
Yeah, I'm very into it. I feel like once you kind of understand it, even on a base level, you kind of see it everywhere that becomes, to me, that's like the whole Torah.
Yeah,
That's like
it's
Mi Bein Shtei Akruvim, that's the burning bush, that's like Avraham Avinu's experience, that's like everyone's.
yeah. It certainly seems, and that certainly seems to be the way that the Jewish mystics are reading our own tradition, which is that there is, and there are many, many, many examples of this. We speak one of the very first literary forms of Jewish mysticism that we have after Tanakh is the Ma'aser Merkava, which expounds on the vision of Ezekiel in the first chapter there of the divine chariot, and over there the people who see the chariot are called Yordei Merkava. They descend the chariot, and the description is that they physically, physiologically, and psychologically go down into themselves, that they descend into their own insides. They go through the Chadri Chadarim Shal Libram, this is what Rabbeinu Hananel says on the Gemara there, that they go into the chambers of their own hearts. These are the celestial chambers. We see the same thing with the people who even those that ascend to Paradise, the Arba Shnichnas Paradise. So if you look on the Talmudic page, Rashi's reading there on Arba Shnichnas Paradise, on the full that enter paradise, this other earthly space. They go there, according to Rashi, they go there through divine names, through Shemus, which is reciting divine names. These sort of mantras is a very old practice in Jewish mysticism. But other commentators read it that they're going through their, which is a form of meditation. But others read it that they're really descending like the Yordei Merkava into the depths of their own paradise. And what they encounter there, it seems to be, is they encounter themselves, which is why when the Talmud reads the vision of Ezekiel, each one of the sages who recounts what the man upon the chariot, what this anthropomorphic figure, the human on the chariot, looked like, they describe a person of their own background. So Rabbi Yossi says it was Ishakfar. Rabbi Hanani, each one says it was the person from where they came, because they were essentially seeing some sort of projection of the ultimate self, which is the human, which is the God created in the image of human, the human created in the image of God on the throne. The same thing, and then hundreds of years later, the same thing with Avram Abulafi, who I know you're a fan of. He speaks about it, and he advises his students explicitly. And this is one of the very rare instances where we have people speaking about what happens in a Jewish mystical experience. There's a small book collected by Louis Jacobs called Jewish Mystical Testimonies, I think is Jacob's book. And he brings together these few citations. Over there, Abulafi writes to his students that what you're going to encounter after you've done his own form of mantras and body movements and his own kind of strange yoga that he has with letters, building on Sefer Yetzirah and the Chassidic Ashkenaz, he says that you're going to encounter the image of a human, and it will be yourself that you're encountering. You're going to see yourself, and you have to see past that. And this notion of encountering the divine self and seeing the self in either abstracted from us or deep inside of us, and then getting beyond that self. The process of bittul in Jewish mysticism, the process of fana in Islam and in Sufism, the process of crucifixion in Christianity, the realization of anatman in Buddhism, a very, very basic principle in all mystical traditions, which then leads us not to a state of nothingness, but to a state of a rebirth within that nothingness of a true self, of the divine. And in that rebirth comes kindness, and comes empathy, and comes compassion, and comes bliss, and comes timelessness, and comes beauty. And these are the things that we strive for as people along a mystical path.
Until you're born again as a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven.
There you go. Straight from the mouth himself.
From the OG Rebbe.
I think it's high time. I haven't done this publicly on my channel yet, but I think it's high time that Judaism reclaims Jesus as a spiritual master who was raised and weaned and brought up and trained within within the bowels of Judaism. And this is a project which has started already. I think Martin Buber may have been the most popular advocate for this position. Chaim McAvoy has taken a similar position, and others. And I think there's a lot of beauty in doing that, and I think that there's a lot of trauma and a lot of pain that Jews have experienced by the hands of Christians for millennia, and we're not going to ignore history or deny history.
Yeah.
But I think that from a place where we stand today, where we can begin to live a post-traumatic Judaism, a Judaism which is no longer defined by our fears and by our scars, but one which is defined by the highest values of Judaism, we can see those values being expressed in the Baal Shem Tov, in the Arizal, in the Ramak, in Cordovero, in Abulafia, in Rambam, and I think we can open our eyes to see them being expressed also in the person of Jesus. And we may get crucified for saying this, but I do think it's true.
I think the way to avoid crucifixion is, first of all, don't go, but is understanding, first of all, that there's whoever the person was or wasn't as like a mitziyut, this person, and then there's the stories we heard from different sources, there's different versions of how he died, and you have to separate that and understand that, like, on a certain level, having a machlokas in mitzias right now, of like this person who existed a couple thousand years ago, who, what, when, and where. And there's no right answer. In other words, if this is my version of who he was and what he was trying to do, then he's holy. Right. And if this is not the right version, then he wasn't. And if your version is accurate, then it's a question of what he did or didn't say and what he did or didn't do, and what his followers recorded, and whether we're even talking about the same person. Because there's a lot of people who think that, like, there were multiple Jesuses, and everyone has talking about a different person.
Yeah, so there's a helpful distinction made in academia over the past few decades between what's known as the Jesus of history and then the Jesus of faith, let's say, for example. What it allows us to do is to say that there are multiple people that take on this persona character because it's a person playing multiple roles for different people in different ways. So there's a historical Jesus, which may have done some things and may have said some things, and we don't have much evidence or knowledge about them, unfortunately. But then there's Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus of faith, there's Jesus of the Catholics, there's Jesus of the Protestants, there's Jesus of the Lutherans, and Jesus of, there's 10,000 Jesuses. There's a white Jesus and a black Jesus and a gay Jesus and a straight. There's like so many. There's a Jesus of the South and the North and the West and the East. And I think back to what we were saying earlier, that an idea is valuable if it has positive fruit. We can say to ourselves, is there value in Jews today, deeply committed practicing Jews, finding, like, carving out our own, like, we should be entitled to have our own Jesus. Like, if there's 10,000 Jesus out there, there can be one more. And it seems to be that the Jesus of that would be the Jesus that fits within the tradition of Jewish mysticism, and therefore the Jesus which is most aligned with reading the Christian mystics. So we're not inventing a Jesus. We're just taking up, the Christian mystics reading and seeing him as a Jewish character. And there's been some scholarship to this extent of reading Jesus in the context of Jewish mysticism, specifically of its time. Siegel has done, I forget his first name. Siegel has done some work looking at Jesus and Paul as participating.
Dr. Sledge just did something. Dr. Justin Sledge.
Right. So slightly different about looking at Jesus in the context of miracle workers
as a Galilean miracle.
I'm saying
worker.
Slightly different. I'm saying it's looking at the actual, not as a magician but as a mystic. And there's been some work done on looking at.
I don't think there's a difference. Is there?
I think so. I think there is a distinction to be made here. But what I'm saying is specifically, like, looking at what are the mystical traditions of the time, and whether that's the spirituality of the Essenes, of the Therapeutai, which we don't know much about, or whether it's the Yeridei Merkava, the mystics of the Meister Merkava tradition, and later the Heichalot, and looking for commonalities and similarities between the descriptions of their phenomenology, of their experience, and what happens in the New Testament. And I think that's a fruitful direction to go. And also there's another direction here for the scholarly in the crowd. There's a whole body of literature. Okay, so there's this term which was used in academia, which is not used anymore, which was called intertestamental literature. It's not used because it makes all kind of weird assumptions and connotations, but basically anything that came after the end of Tanakh, Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, and the beginning of the New Testament, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and anything between then. The term that's now used in scholarship is Second Temple literature, and that includes the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha and early Chazal and the New Testament. And that's all in that early period of Bayis Sheni, of the Second Temple. And there's a lot of very, very rich mysticism, I would say, in that canon of Second Temple literature, in this non-canonized canon. And some of the themes that we see there are specifically these themes, and we see this being spoken about in regards to Moshe Rabbeinu, in regards to Moses, where the individual can go through a process of purification, this kind of Gnostic moment, which is also operating at the same time. And in that purification, they can become a channel to the divine. They can speak the word of God through their own lips, which is later picked up by Chazal, by the Talmudic rabbis, of the notion of Shechina Medaberes Mesech Groene, that Shechina speaks through the throat of the individual. And in that notion, there is, to use another fancy term here, there's what's known as the apotheosis of the individual. The individual becomes deified, becomes a god in some sense. And this is an idea which we see bouncing around in whether it's in the character of Chanoich, Enoch, and we have the Enochian literature of that same period, whether it's the character of Moshe Rabbeinu, whether it's later the character of Rashbi in a bit of a later moment in Jewish literature. And it seems to be that this, I haven't seen anyone write like a conclusive research on this piece, and if no one does, I may have to do it myself. But I think that there is this realization of this deification, angelification, apotheosis of the individual, the potential for the individual to reach their divine capacity, which is something which we see encouraged in the biblical text in certain small seeds. The halachta b'drach, of walking in the ways of God, which is then like taking this obligation to imitate God, imitato Dei in Latin, or viladafka boy, to cleave to God and to cleave and unite, the terms which often are close to each other. But anyhow, there seems to be a potential in the thought of the moment in the literature that we see of the human embodying a divinity, God, and therefore what we see then, and there actually has been some work done in this regard by Shaul Magid. He wrote a book called Hasidism Incarnate, where he lays out some of this research and some others as well. What we see there is that this notion of the deification of the human as not being some sort of pagan or Christian idea, but something which emerges out of the matrix of Jewish thought of its day. And I mean, we spoke earlier about expanding the palace of Judaism, the palace of Torah, opening to wider sources. We're going really wide here. We're including the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha and the Essenes, but so be it. I think there's a lot of and I think that those ideas continue to be active throughout Jewish mysticism, throughout the early Kabbalists, and all the way up to the Hasidic thinkers, and that's specifically the case that Shaul Magid makes.
This is my understanding. I've recently been learning a lot about Mashiach ben Yosef, a lot of the Kabbalah of the Vilna Gaon. And this is what he holds most of the inyan is, that Yosef goes down into Mitzrayim, he learns all the occult wisdoms, and then he brings them back to Judaism, Ki'ilu. He like takes what everyone else has to offer, and he's like, this is really what we have over here, and he brings it back to the Tzad of Kedusha.
Yeah.
That's the idea of Tikkun Yesod.
Yes, yeah. So there's this notion in Chazal, amongst the Talmudic sages, that gets picked up by the Kabbalists and the Hasidic thinkers, of the wealth which the Jews took out of Egypt. That there was some sort of, and there's all midrashim about during the plague of darkness, the Jews went and they took the money that was owed to them for the years of servitude from their masters, and there's this descriptions of the immense physical wealth, and also again by the splitting of the sea that Pharaoh rode out with his gold on the chariots in a very audacious kind of move. And when the chariots miraculously washed up, the Jews took all of those gold and silver and brought them to the temple. So that's the general reading, that there's a material wealth which the Jews walk out of Egypt with, which is the promise that God makes to Abraham, that your descendants will go into exile, that after the exile they'll walk out with a great amount of wealth. And the Kabbalists and the Jewish mystics read this not as not only as material wealth, but primarily as spiritual wealth. And the Kabbalists often don't see much of a distinction between the material and the physical. There's a sense where those two can meld into each other, particularly when the material is going to be smelted down literally and turned into the tabernacle, the Mishkan, where the presence of God, the greatest spiritual wealth, takes place. And the union of the human with the divine, and the empathy and compassion that flows from that, the greatest wealth possible. So there's a very, very rich motif of the wealth which comes from the spiritual wealth, which comes, and this kind of ties in two directions. There's one which is this notion of Egypt being the primordial center of all esoteric occultism and wisdom, which is why movements like Hermeticism attach themselves retrospectively to the wisdom of Egypt. Alchemy does the same thing as well. There's this sort of mythic concept of Egypt as the source of all occult wisdom, which is something which we see as well in rabbinic literature. That there's the Chartumei Mitzrayim, even in the biblical text, there's these magicians that are really capable of pulling out extraordinary feats. They're very steeped in magic, which the Talmudic sages read as magic from purity, but magic nonetheless. And then there's a later Hasidic reading, which is a really fascinating one, which is in the Hasidic mind, based on the Kabbalists, there's this notion of nitzutzim. I'll just explain this a little for the audience. Yitzy, you're aware already. The nitzutz is the divine spark, the vitality, the energy within a thing which vitalizes it and keeps it in existence. And it's when we consume, let's say, a bit of food, it is we digest and discard the husk, the klipa, the shell, and what we're absorbing is the nitzutz. We're absorbing the divine spark, and it's our job to collect those sparks and to use that energy for good, and thereby elevate those sparks into divine consciousness. An idea, by the way, which we find amongst the Gnostics as well, that there's the shattering and the sparks which fall into existence. So this is one of the great myths of the Kabbalists, enumerated most extensively by Isaac Luria in 16th century Tzfat. So here's what they do with this idea, a very beautiful idea. They say that according to the biblical narrative, there was a famine in the land. And whether that means the whole world or the inhabited world in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, is debatable, but either how. And what happens is, based on the advice of Joseph, Joseph collects their 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. This is a very familiar story, which most children that read the Bible know. Joseph collects these stockhouses of food to feed for when the 7 years of famine come, based on the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream of the 7 fat cows, the 7 skinny cows. And what happens is, when Egypt does hold all that grain and the famine hits, as he predicted, the whole world comes, or the whole region comes rushing to Egypt because they need their food. And what they're doing is they're bringing their money with them to buy food from Egypt. And the nitzutz, the energy, the power is in their money, is in their purchasing power. What is money? Money is just really congealed energy, is time, is effort that is tokenized into a form that humans recognize that can be exchanged. And they're bringing all of this wealth, they're bringing all of this energy to Egypt, which becomes overnight, according to this narrative, the superpower of the world, but Kabbalistically becomes the sinkhole of all of the world's sparks come streaming into Egypt from all directions, right? They're like, all of this is coming in, and therefore part of the process of the Jews descending for when the famine hits to leave is specifically to take those sparks and to take all those sparks and to elevate them into the final redemption, into the encounter with God at Sinai, and then the building of the tabernacle, and finally the arrival in the land of Israel. And there is kind of this messianic plan that all the sparks were supposed to be collected there, the 613 sparks, the 600,000 sparks represented by the people, and they were supposed to take those and then effectuate the tikkun, the redemption, the re-gathering and re-elevation of these sparks. Something along the way went wrong, and they spent 40 years wandering around the desert, chasing their own tails, and we're still doing the work to try to clean up what happened there. And that's something which the Kabbalists speak about at great length. But so there is this very real notion of which you brought up from the Vilna Gaon, from the Gra, of the spiritual work of descending into the depths and into our own modern Egypts, right? What is Egypt for the Kabbalists is not a geographic location; it's a psychological location. It's a place of our own constraint, our own restrictions, our own boundaries, our own borders, and going into those dark places and seeing what sparks lay in our own places of smallness, in our own constricted consciousness, in our own katnut hamochen, that we can elevate into our own redemptions. And that's beautiful work.
Incorporating our shadow for the Jungian people.
Working through our own shadows.
Yeah.
our own Egypt.
Going back to something I mentioned, and I don't know, it sounds like you didn't really agree. The idea of the mystic and the magician. I'm curious how you define those.
Yeah. So there's it's a good question. There's a lot of terms that get thrown around together with one another. There's mysticism, there's magic, there's occultism, there's esotericism, and sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And I think that language is very important, and I like to be as precise as I can with my language, particularly when it comes to terms that indicate larger categories at play. And the more clear we can be with the words we use, the more clear we can be in our own thinking and in our communication, and therefore in our lives as a whole. So people sometimes be like, Zevi, why are you being such a stickler for language? Like, Azov, let it go. But I'm like language is really, really important. And according to the Kabbalist, language is fundamental to it's essential to existence. It's what creates our realities, and
Right.
it's on and on. So,
Abracadabra.
yes, back to the magic. Well done. I think like this. I have there's a term in linguistics and in mathematics and other areas called a heuristic. Heuristic means that it's not a precise definition that's going to apply to all cases, but it's a working definition, which is a good one.
Goes back to our MS conversation.
Say it again.
Goes back to the truth conversation a little bit. Like, it works. So
It works.
you know.
Nachan. And to try and do this in 30 seconds and not 3 hours, and I do have 3-hour conversations attempting to define mysticism and differentiate it from shamanism and paganism and magic, and you can check out those on the channel. You've probably seen some of them.
I'd love
I
to.
think
I've seen some.
I think that a simple heuristic is to ask ourselves, what is the goal of the practitioner, if they are a mystic, a magician, or an esotericist. Let's use those three, and I might include occultists as well. Let's see.
What it might be, it is, you familiar with
Yeah.
Rai Kaplan's differentiation of Kabbalah? There's like 3 schools
Sure.
of Kabbalah.
Sure.
3 aspects really. So he says there's the theoretical Kabbalah, which is
Yeah.
like the framework.
Yes.
There's the meditative Kabbalah, which is like trying to achieve different states of consciousness, and then there's the practical Kabbalah, which is some sort of white magic. So I think what you just said, those 3 kind of fit each one into its own category, but I'm curious how you would describe it.
Yes, I think there's good overlap there, and I think I often do work with those categories, dividing things, let's say, into experience, theory, and practice is a similar division to what you just gave. I think that in terms of what the objective, what the goal of the practitioner is, it seems to me that in the magician, in the person practicing magic, there is an attempt, and this would overlap with Kaplan's categories, which are then used as well by Moshe Idel, of what's known as theurgy, theurgical mysticism or theurgic Kabbalah, which is or what becomes Kabbalah Ma'asit, practical Kabbalah, which is that there's some attempt to change, affect, or manipulate reality to one's own desires, either for one's own personal gain or for the larger gain, in a specific direction. There's some sense, a desire for power or mastery over the natural or supernatural order of things, and that is so a quest to be able to yield one's rituals and incantations and practices for some sort of, and that could be to heal, it could be to bring rain, it could be to curse someone, it could be for anything, but there's some sort of power to effectuate something in the world. There's a quest for power, and I don't mean that power has a very negative flavor in our mouth these days ever since Foucault, and I don't mean it in a negative sense. I just mean that there's an instrumentalization, there's the ability to do something with it. So I would say magic as a quest for power is for agency, let's say. Then I would say that if we're using this metric of what's the practitioner aiming for, I would say that the esotericist and sometimes also the occultist is specifically the one that is looking for hidden wisdom. That's what esoteric means. It means the hidden typically referring to a knowledge which is hidden. And there's some sort of quest for knowledge. They want to know the secrets. There's a gnosis there. And that's the theosophical Kabbalists, right? They want to know what the shape of God is, what the structure of reality is, what the human psyche is, and it's a knowledge which is a transformative knowledge, and I'm not reducing it to some sort of propositional scientific, but we do see that it does make its way into science. For example, someone like Isaac Newton, one of the greatest sciences of modernity, is a person who's deeply invested in multiple forms of esotericism, including Kabbalah, because there's a desire for knowledge. They want to know, know thyself. The Maxi of Delphim. So let's say magician is the quest for agency or power. The esotericist, sometimes also the occultist, is the quest for knowledge. I would say then what the mystic is, and I may be biased here because I'm on team mystic, but I think the desire of the mystic is neither for power or to sure, they want things in the world to change, and they're often they're the prophets, and they're the soothsayers, and they're the ones that are going out there and sharing a message, but they're not trying to and there's a lot of overlap between these three categories, so don't think that one is human is one and not the other, and vice versa. But I think that the mystic, there's definitely an element of a desire for change, the desire for knowledge. The mystic wants to know as well. That's certainly very high value. But I think more than those, there's the mystic's desire is one for a unitive love with their concept of God or ultimate reality. It's a desire to melt in oneness with reality itself. Evelyn Underhill defines the mystic or mysticism as the art of union with reality. So I would say that if the magician is questing for agency and power, and the esotericist is questing for knowledge, for hidden knowledge particularly, then the mystic is questing for unitive love. And I'm on team mystic here. And
same.
And there's definitely, I just want to say again, these are heuristic distinctions and definitions. There's a lot better technical definitions, and those have been given, and we've discussed them. But this is just, if you need an easy point of reference to remember, this is kind of an easy category.
So the thing specifically with the categories of mystic and magician, which my understanding is it's a machlokas, like there's disagreements as to where you draw the line between these categories. Obviously, how much they overlap and not. Rabbi Kaplan, it would seem, is of the opinion that they overlap to a tremendous extent in the idea of the magician is really connecting sort of mystically somehow, and he's channeling that energy that he's getting from his mystical experience, and he's manifesting it into physical reality.
Yeah. Firstly, I would say his or her, because there are many women who are mystics and magicians, both in the general tradition and in Judaism as well. We did a video on the channel on 10 women Jewish mystics, and most of those are actually more inclined in the direction of what we would call Kabbalah Ma'asit. They're more on the magic side of things, and whether that's trying to read the future in certain very magical ways, or sort of affect people's prosperity. I think that when we say mystical, it's a word which lacks understanding. It's not necessarily a helpful word to use as an adjective. I think if we talk about mysticism as some sort of experience of unity with God or reality, as a participatory mysticism, which is a term from Jorge Ferreira, I think that certainly the magician who is working theurgically to affect reality, particularly in the Jewish tradition, is working in a participatory function. So they understand that the world is constructed in divine letters, let's say, and therefore they use their own speech to manipulate the lettering of the reality to change something. And therefore there's something participatory, i.e. mystical. There's something unitive. They're part of the big picture, i.e. mystical. So therefore what they're doing is magical and mystical, I would say. Or, for example, if the Kabbalah sees the Shefa, the energy coming down from God, a term which actually comes from Maimonides' Moreh Nevuchim, a translation of the Arabic Fayed over there, the Kabbalah sees, so to speak, the Shefa raining down from the divine, and they can tap into that Shefa and push it in the directions that they want and bring what they want. And this is an idea of Maimonides himself, that we can affect the way that the Shefa, this divine energy overflow, comes to us. So therefore they're participating in reality, they're participating in the fundamental structures of reality. And that, I would say, is unitive, is participatory, is not seeing themselves as fundamentally disconnected and detached from reality. Therefore, yes, mystical. But so I'm not excluding the magician from the
Right, right.
category of mysticism. I'm just saying, if we're going to focus primarily on what they're trying to get at, we could say that if they're trying to effectuate something, then they're doing something theurgical, they're doing something magical. Whereas someone, for example, let's say like the Alter Rebbe, who writes that sticking within our own tradition, although there are examples certainly from outside. There's a very similar turn of expression from I think it's Ibn Attar, the Sufi, where the Alter Rebbe writes that Ich will nicht dein Olam haba, ich will nicht dein Gan Eden. Like I don't want your paradise, I don't want your rewards, I don't want your angels, I don't want your I didn't even want your gifts and bounty in this world here. He turns away all the temptations and he says, Ich will nur zich allein, all I want is God alone. There's this sense where the mystic doesn't care so much for the power to manipulate and permutate and change their reality in the benefit for them or their own community. Although that certainly happens, it seems that the primary desire is really just to what is a contemporary mystic, Trevor Hall, the musician.
Yeah.
He says, one of some of my favorite lyrics he writes, I just want to melt away in all your love. And that seems to be the desire of the mystic. There's a deep desire for surrender into reality. And it's not a surrender which is passivistic. It doesn't make us a puddle that has no agency in the world. It makes us incredibly powerful to go ahead and be the vehicle, to be the Merkava, to go ahead and be God's kindness and manifest God's love in the world. I'll just to end this little stream of consciousness on this thought, the Kabbalah says so beautifully that the avot, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, hein hamerkava, they are the divine chariot, which basically means that the divine chariot, as understood by the mystics, is God as manifest through the 10 sefirot, and each one of the patriarchs represents one of these sefirot. So Abraham represents Chesed. And the Kabbalists write that there was what's known as a histalkus hachesed. There's a elevation or an absence really of the sphere of chesed in the world, because Abraham was so fully embodying this divine element of loving kindness that the sphere itself could take a paid leave, was on vacation. And this is what it means to melt away in God's love. It doesn't mean to become a useless puddle that just sits, in our basements getting high on our own supply. It means that we're empowered to be one with reality, and therefore, if we're one with reality, to live in symbiosis with it, and to live in love with it, and to treat our neighbor and the nature around us and ourselves as if we're part of that oneness. Just to clarify that point, I don't want anyone to think that the mystics are useless addicts, addicted to God or
By the
something.
way, just to bring this back to what our whole conversation before, you can also, if you want, there's a reading of understanding the debate between like Jesus and the rabbis of how much does the mystic play magician. Obviously Jesus wasn't the only mystic. There were plenty of other mystics.
Right.
But Jesus felt like the idea of a lot of the mystical insight and stuff like that is to effectuate change. It's to play magician on a certain level. And the rabbi's like, no, we don't play magician. It's not.
Okay, so it's interesting because we spoke before about like the many Jesuses, right? So there is a rabbinic Jesus, or there's actually more than one rabbinic Jesus, but there is this notion in the Talmud of Jesus as the magician. And there's also this notion that we brought up of the secrets of Egypt, and that's a theme because Jesus, according to the Gospels, does go down to Egypt. So that theme does make it into Talmudic literature of the magical secrets that Jesus brings from Egypt, and what happens in the temple and all that jazz. I don't know. Like I think that the rabbinic reading of Jesus is happening at a much later moment in history than what we see in some earlier versions of Jesus, and it's happening already after a good, if not centuries, already a few decades of Christian persecution. Christianity already is well on its way to becoming the state religion of the Holy Roman Empire, which is not very holy at all, and there's a lot of persecution, a lot of bloodshed, and the Christians who went from being persecuted by the Romans and being fed to lions in the Colosseum ended up turning that, and Jews become the ones that are hunted. And so I think that the animosity that we see towards Jesus in the early rabbinic literature is one which is being written from a place of persecution and a place of this character. We can now speak much more freely about Jesus because we're not afraid for our lives because of Christian crusades, as many Jews were for hundreds of years.
Right.
But the rabbis that are writing are writing about a person, or like a persona, an idea of a person, a character, who was the excuse used by hordes to rape and pillage and murder their families. So we can understand why their reading is not a kind reading of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to be sensitive to our own history and to the ways that characters of Jesus have been abused, and how we as a people have been abused because of those abuses of the character. But having said that, I think that we perhaps are in a moment of history where we can begin to heal from that and begin to come to a more positive character, which is not the character of the Talmud.
Yeah, I think so too. But just that idea also of what do you do with this body of like mystical information? Like, do we walk around performing miracles for people, or is that inappropriate? You know, I think you can easily read that into the storyline of where where he felt like that's part of having the knowledge, is using it, and they're like, no, this is like a mystical secret knowledge. We're not supposed to walk around flaunting it. And I would argue throughout history, the rabbis were proven right. I would argue on a certain level, because he gave over these mystical concepts and ideas to people who clearly, in my opinion, didn't understand them, were not proper vessels to accept them, and then went and turned around and massacred, tens, hundreds, or not hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout history. So
it's interesting. There's two kind of things that are coming up here. One of them is that, in terms of performing miracles, so Jesus in the Gospels is described as going around and healing people. And a motif which we see, continued all the way through the Kabbalists and all the way into the beginnings of the Hasidic movement with the Baalei Shem, these shamanistic figures that are wandering around the Carpathian Mountains and healing people and giving them their remedies. And so this notion of the mystic as healer is, and we see the prophet. The prophet is the one who goes and resurrects the dead. So this is an old idea, and there's definitely always a debate around what is the right time and space and permissibility to be flexing and flaunting one's miracles. And Judaism has some sort of respect for the laws of nature as God sets them up in Jewish thinking, and we don't love when those laws of nature are contravened. And even within the Talmudic discussion, the rabbinic discussion itself, we're always trying to find reasons of why God is not actually bending nature when a miracle is being performed. There's a principle in the Talmud called that God doesn't simply make needless miracles, and in a character like Maimonides, that principle gets taken to a really far degree. So there's always this tension in Judaism about how much do we mess with nature and how much do we not do that, and do we let things. There's a sense of like in a lot of films, like in the past 10 years or so, of like time travel, like how much do we actually want to go back and mess with something, and like what will be the ramifications of us playing God. So that's always a fear that the rabbis have, certainly. And then there's a second question of revealing esoteric knowledge, revealing these truths. And that's, again, a theme that constantly is battled throughout Jewish history. It's a debate within the mystics themselves of how much of this information is supposed to be kept esoteric, hidden, and how much of it should be made revealed. In the last 200 years of Jewish history, for anyone that knows a bit of Jewish history, that debate really, really blows up in the debate between the Hasidic movement and their oppositions, the Mitnagdim, who the Mitnagdim, by the way, weren't non-mystics. Most people think that they were some sort of cold, dry, legalistic, Pharisees, the way that the rabbis are portrayed in the times of Jesus. They actually were some of the greatest mystics of the generation themselves, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, who we've been mentioning, who was seen as the lead opposition to the Hasidic movement, the person who puts the Alter Rebbe, the founder of one of the most influential Hasidic dynasties, in excommunication, in Cherem, was one of Judaism's premier mystics of his day and Kabbalists of his day. And this is no secret. This is like well known. So it's a debate amongst the mystics themselves of how much is this information shed and how much of it is revealed. One of my I grew up in, I was born into, and I still feel like my soul belongs to the Hasidic movement, and therefore I'm obviously on the side of the Baal Shem Tov, on the side of, in this context we would say Jesus as well, of that this information is vital information and needs to be shared with the world, and that the world, yes, it is dangerous to share, but without sharing it, what chance do we have for survival? And I don't know if we can conflate or see a causal relationship between historical Christian violence and early Christian mysticism. I think that, to the contrary, I think that it's the intertangling of politics and power in the form of the Roman Empire, which is more responsible for that, and some other doctrines which emerge from Poland, without getting too much into that. But I think that the mystical impulse is with very rare exception in history, one that leads to violence and persecution. It's one, when done right, which leads to compassion and acceptance and love and generosity of spirit. And I think it like definitionally must be so. I think that there's a parable, one of my favorite parables, told by the early Hasidic movement about this debate precisely, which you're probably aware of, but I'll share it for the audience because it's a beautiful one, of the prince who's dying. The prince is a common motif in early Hasidic literature. Rabbi Nachman has, many stories that involve the prince. But I think this story originates with the Alter Rebbe, and princess as well. Yeah, well done. Of the prince that is the prince that is dying, and no one can heal the prince, and all the doctors from all over the king's lands come to try and heal him, and every day he's just getting sicker and sicker and on the brink of death. And finally, this one old creepy looking shaman dude rocks up, and he has like this little bag, and they barely want to even let him through like the palace security, but he comes inside and he tells the king, he says, I can cure your son, but you have to promise me that whatever I say as part of the remedy, you're going to listen to, and you're going to let me execute. And all of the like advisors were ambivalent, like, oh, you can't trust this vagabond off the street that hasn't showered in weeks with your son's life. And the king says, listen, what can I do anyways? My son is so sick. He's about to, like, he's gonna die. We would say in Yiddish, we would say Maimonides, like he's gonna die either way. Like, what are we gonna do about it? So the king says, yes, I'll let you have your way. And the beggar right away says, give me your crown. And again, trepidation in the palace room, the king's crown. He takes down the king's crown and he smashes off the central gem in the middle of the crown. And everyone is freaking out. The king says, no, I gave him my word. He has my permission. He's allowed to do what he's doing. And in the side of the room, the prince is there gurgling and dying and slowly like breathing his last breaths. And this magician begins to smash the crown into tiny pieces, into a fine powder. And people are losing it. They're like, the most precious gem that's been passed down for centuries and generations is being smashed in front of their eyes by some guy off the street. And the king, whose word is final, says no, like he has reign to do what he needs to do. And he mixes this dust with some water, and he begins to try and pour it into the mouth of the prince. And the prince is so sick that he can't even drink anymore. And one drop gets into the prince's mouth, and the prince's color comes back to his face, and he begins to come back to life. And the parable here, obviously, is that there is a hidden wisdom. There is the gem of the crown of God. The crown of God is Torah, and the gem of that crown is the hidden aspect of Torah, is the nistar, is the heart of Torah, is Kabbalah, is Chassidut, is the mysticism. And the vagabond is the mystic, who really is a vagabond. Most mystics, they're pretty unsavory characters from the looks of it. The Baalei Shem were people that no one would have trusted, with $10. And they come in and they take the crown. They take the crown jewel of Judaism, the mysticism, and they begin to smash it into tiny digestible pieces, and they begin to mix it with water and dilute it, and they begin to pour it into the prince's mouth, into the dying mouth of the people of Israel and of humanity at large, who are in this state of they're like almost on the brink of death, and with the hopes that just one drop will make it into their mouths, and they will see that the prince will come back to life, and this is the last chance that they have. So this debate is very real, and I think what we see in the past 200 years is what would have happened. Let's play a historical what if the Baal Shem Tov never would have been born and never would have done his work. Where would Judaism be today? The Baal Shem Tov gave such a strong injection of vitality and passion and happiness and joy and love and song and dance into Judaism in a way that was never done before, and he was repeating this pattern of the mystics throughout history. And the Baal Shem Tov writes the later Chassidic masters. His name was Yisrael. And what you do when a person is fainting, when a person is in a state of hisalfus, as it is in Hebrew, you call them by their name. You say Yitzy. You shake them by their name. You shake them and call them by their name. And their name is what brings them back to consciousness. And the Chassidic masters say that Yisrael Baal Shem, his name was Yisrael, which is the name of the Jewish people. His very being was us being called by our name, by Yisrael. And his whole existence was calling the Jew, saying, wake up. Hisari, wake up, wake up. Kiva Erech Komi Uri, because our time to shine has come. And so I'm firmly on the side of the mystics who say that this information must be taken off the pedestal. It must be taken out of the throne room. It must be crushed up. It must be put out on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and podcast. And this is the work that we're doing here.
Amen. Wow, that's a beautiful mashal and a beautiful story. I actually don't think I ever heard that.
Yeah, it's a so the context of the story is that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chassidic dynasty, which I belong to, the Chabad Lubavitch tradition, was put in prison in St. Petersburg for there were practical political reasons why he was put in prison. He was sending money at time to the British. No, what was it at the time? To
Some
no,
government?
he was sending money to the land of Israel, which was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and which was at war with Russia. And he was ratted out for sending money to Russia's enemies. But instead, he was trying to support the starving Jews of the what's known as the Old Yishuv. As a true mystic, as a really a person who embodied the love of the mystic, that when there was another Jew halfway across the world starving, that he did all that he could to help them. And the Alter Rebbe is the person who goes in his kittel on Yom Kippur to chop wood for the starving mother who gave birth to the starving widow who gave birth to a child and had no one to feed her. This is the Alter Rebbe. This is the mystic who breaks the mold for love and for kindness. Anyhow,
There's this weird phenomena that I realized once in like a meditation, that all these people, not all of them, but a lot of them, who kind of wanted to really change the course of Jewish history, or they were messianic figures, or they were trying to be messianic, or this or that, really suffered. And you can take this back all the way to like Yosef, right? Who was talking to his father about issues that he saw going on, right? But generally what happens is people, rat them out, and they end up suffering for the good that they're trying to effectuate the change. And is a weird, all these people who thought they were Mashiach, if you go through history, that all ended up obviously weren't Mashiach because Mashiach didn't come. A lot of them were ratted out. It's like a weird, in other words, a lot of the Jesus stories are that, they ratted him out to the government. And, Shlomo Molcho is another person who was ratted out to the government. And Shabtai Tzvi is another person who was ratted out to the government. And in a sense, they all failed, and maybe could have, and it was really the Sinas Chinam which made them fail.
Yeah. It's certainly an interesting motif. There's definitely there's a notion. I mean, there's a well-known notion of the suffering Messiah. The suffering Jew who tries to effectuate positive change and is persecuted. But the point that I was just trying to make, I also have to say, I should have told you this earlier, I have another appointment at 3:00. So
yeah. We'll wrap up.
Unless I postpone that a little, because I am enjoying this conversation.
Same.
Okay, good. So what happens is he's put in prison, and so there's this sort of physical manifestation of the reason why he's in prison, because he's sending money to the Jews living under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, but there's a spiritual reason going on, because everything that happens in the physical world, according to the mystics, is a reflection of a spiritual reality, and the spiritual reason is because there's what's known as a kitrug, there's a decree from heaven that, as it's phrased, that he was spreading Chassidut in a way that was so abundant and so over the top, that it was too much. And it's sort of this image of the advisors in the king's palace saying, like, telling the king you have to stop him, and he gets thrown in prison as a result of this spiritual reality. And there's like this technicality that there was a piece of Chassidut, a piece of Chassidic literature which was written, which fell into like the sewer or something, and that was like, and then the angels in this like sort of mystical experience, in this like kind of vision, the angels bring up this piece of dirtied secrets, and they bring it up to the royal throne, and they say, look what's happening to your secret. It's like the advisor saying, look what's happening to your crown, it's being splattered all over the ground. And the Alter Rebbe, according to this narrative, teaches this parable, and this parable is what wins him the court case. It's like this advocacy. He's a lawyer on behalf of mysticism, and it's what allows him to finally be released, which is a day which is celebrated until today by the Chabad community. So that's the work, and that's the challenges, and I'm sure there will be pushback, and I'm sure the work that you're doing is going to have opposition and is not going to go down smoothly, but hopefully we do it with a smile, and with a smile and a spoonful of sugar, things go down a bit easier, and we do it because we believe it, and we do it because we must.
Yeah, amen. Can you just talk a little bit about your channel and what the work is exactly that you're doing as well, before you go?
Yeah, the channel is called Seekers of Unity. It's here on YouTube. It's also available on podcasts, but primarily YouTube. And it's an attempt to explore the history and philosophy of mysticism from a unitive aspect. So understanding the mystics as people who are pursuing unity, pursuing love, and understanding how that pursuit is shared amongst the mystical traditions of the world. And that's both in the mystical experiences of the world's various traditions, in their theories, in their metaphysics primarily, and also in their practices and their techniques and ethics. So expanding the conversation and the exploration from just a conversation about Jewish mysticism to a global narrative. And this is the notion that really drives it, is this idea of emetz me'aretz titzmach that we started with, that there's a truth that comes from the ground. If we begin bottom up from the human experience, what is the human experiencing in these moments, and what are the theories that the human puts forth, and how has this emerged historically? And we're doing it with very high ideals, I think, but also with very serious rigor. And it's like the work that I'm doing is very heavily researched, and anything that I'm quoting is with full citations, peer-reviewed, and trying to be intellectually honest and transparent, and trying to really rebuild up a structure, a palace of unity that is not just a Jewish story, and but is really a human story, and I believe it exists, and we're out on a bear hunt, and we're going to catch a big one.